Have you ever wondered how much power a single person can hold? How someone who seems like an ordinary citizen might actually be the key to dismantling a system of corruption? It's a thought that often lingers in the back of our minds, especially when injustice seems all around us. But what if the person standing next to you, the one seemingly overlooked, was secretly the most powerful force in the room? Stay with me, because this is a story you won't want to miss. And if you're passionate about justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. It was a normal Tuesday afternoon when Officer Blake pulled over a car in the heart of downtown. The air was thick with tension, but no one paid much attention to it. Blake had made this stop 1,000 times before. Another routine traffic stop, another suspect to humiliate. His sharp white uniform contrasted with the gray concrete of the street, and the city buzzed around him as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. Yet, there was something in the air that felt different this time. Perhaps it was the way the man in the car had looked at him, or the way his eyes never wavered from Blake's. Officer Blake, known for his aggression toward anyone who didn't meet his standards, approached the vehicle with the usual cocky stride. The man inside, the one Blake assumed to be yet another troublemaker, was black, wearing a dark coat and sunglasses. "License and registration," Blake snapped as he leaned down to the window. The man didn't immediately respond. He didn't even flinch. Blake's frustration began to simmer. He was used to people trying to act tough when they were caught in a lie. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against the cold glass. "You deaf, boy," he barked, his voice rising. The man's expression remained calm, but there was a certain stillness about him, like the quiet before a storm. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket and handed over his credentials. Blake looked at the ID, but his eyes narrowed as he saw the name. Jonathan Blackwell. He didn't recognize it, but he was more focused on the disrespect he felt from the man. He glanced at the ID, scoffed, and tossed it onto the hood of the car. "Is this supposed to impress me?" Blake said, clearly irritated. But the man didn't react. Instead, he simply responded, "You may want to take another look at that card." Blake, annoyed by the man's calmness, reached down and grabbed the card again. This time, he took a better look at the title. His eyes widened as he processed the words. Director of Internal Affairs, Department of Justice. Blake froze. The weight of those words hit him like a truck. He blinked twice, hoping he had read it wrong, but there it was in black and white. He was looking at a man who held a position of unimaginable power within the very system he had spent years operating in. The air around them seemed to thicken as Blake's mind raced. How had he not known? He had been so quick to judge, so certain that this man, this troublemaker, was someone he could bully. But now, everything had changed. The power balance had shifted in an instant, and Blake realized he was standing on the edge of a precipice, one misstep away from losing everything. "Mr. Blackwell?" Blake's voice trailed off, unsure of what to say next. His hands, which had been so steady just moments ago, now trembled slightly. For the first time in years, Blake felt fear. True fear. Not the kind he imposed on others, but the kind that struck deep in his chest, the kind that made his stomach churn with the realization of his impending downfall. Jonathan Blackwell remained calm, unshaken by Blake's evident discomfort. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't shown any anger, yet there was a quiet authority in his presence that spoke volumes. "You know, Officer Blake," Jonathan began, his tone smooth but carrying an unmistakable weight, "I've seen a lot of cases like yours. Corruption, abuse of power. It's rampant in this city. But let me tell you something. I don't take kindly to those who tarnish the uniform." Blake's pulse quickened, and for the first time, he felt the undeniable truth of his own vulnerability. Jonathan Blackwell wasn't just some random bureaucrat. He wasn't some desk jockey. He was a man who could bring the whole corrupt system crashing down with a single word. Blake stepped back instinctively, the oppressive reality of the situation sinking in. He had never imagined that today would be the day everything would change. A routine stop had turned into a reckoning, and it was clear that Jonathan Blackwell wasn't a man you could easily intimidate. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jonathan asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Blake's mind raced, but no words came out. The silence stretched between them, suffocating him with its weight. But then, the sound of approaching sirens broke through the air, signaling the arrival of backup. The wailing sirens grew louder, cutting through the heavy tension that hung in the air. Officer Blake's mind raced. His instincts, honed by years of unchecked authority, screamed at him to take control of the situation. But how? The red recording light blinked steadily on Jonathan Blackwell's phone, an unrelenting eye capturing every detail. The street, once just another nameless intersection, had become a stage where justice and arrogance collided. Officer Blake's chest tightened as the weight of reality settled over him. His every move, every word, was now evidence. The silence between them grew suffocating. The younger officer fidgeted uncomfortably, casting nervous glances between Blake and Blackwell. The older officer, a veteran who had long since learned when to step back, sighed and squared his shoulders. "Sir," he said cautiously, addressing Blackwell, "maybe we can discuss this calmly." Jonathan's expression remained unreadable, but his voice held a deliberate sharpness. "Calmly," he repeated. "That's a luxury I wasn't afforded when I was pulled over without cause." Blake swallowed hard, his usual smirk, his cocky stance, all gone. "Look," he started, his voice lower, almost pleading, I didn't know who you were." Jonathan let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "And that's supposed to make this better? You mean if I were just another black man driving home, this would have ended differently?" Blake had no answer. He knew how these situations often played out. His excuses, the ones that had always shielded him before, felt flimsy now, pathetic in the face of someone who could fight back. Jonathan turned slightly, angling the phone towards the younger officer. "What's your name, son?" The young man stiffened. Officer Miller, sir." "Miller." Jonathan studied him. "You heard everything, correct?" Miller hesitated, but nodded. "Yes, sir." "And do you believe this was a lawful stop?" Miller glanced at Blake, whose glare silently screamed at him to stay quiet. But then he looked at Jonathan Blackwell, a man who could single-handedly change the trajectory of his career, a man who stood for something more than just power. Miller took a breath. "No, sir, it wasn't." Blake's head snapped toward him, eyes burning with betrayal. "Miller." "I can't lie, Blake," Miller cut him off, his voice firm. "Not about this." Jonathan's lips pressed into a thin line. "Good," he said. "Then you understand that corruption doesn't just come from the ones who abuse their power. It thrives in those who stand by and do nothing." Miller's face burned with shame, but he nodded. "I do, sir." Jonathan turned the camera back to Blake. "Tell me, Officer Blake, do you regret pulling me over?" Blake's jaw tensed. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to beg for mercy. But years of arrogance, of believing he was untouchable, made it impossible for the words to leave his mouth. Jonathan sighed, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "It doesn't matter if you regret it," he said, "because regret doesn't erase what you did. It doesn't change the people you've hurt before today." Blake's fists clenched at his sides. "Are you going to ruin me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan met his gaze. "No," he said simply. "You did that to yourself." The weight of the words hit Blake like a punch to the gut. The older officer cleared his throat. "Sir, what happens now?" Jonathan glanced down the road where another car had just pulled up, an unmarked black sedan. From the driver's seat, a man in a dark suit stepped out, his expression unreadable but his presence unmistakably authoritative. Blake's stomach turned to ice. Jonathan looked back at him, his expression unreadable. Now, he echoed. A small, knowing smile played at the corner of his lips. Now, we see what accountability really looks like. The unmarked black sedan idled at the curb, its presence a silent announcement that this encounter was far from over. Officer Blake felt the last remnants of his confidence drain away as the suited man approached with measured, deliberate steps. His posture was calm, but there was an undeniable authority in his presence, one that sent a cold wave of dread through Blake's veins. Jonathan Blackwell didn't turn to greet him immediately. Instead, he held Blake's gaze for a long, excruciating moment before finally acknowledging the newcomer. "Director Hayes," Jonathan said, his tone composed but heavy with meaning. Blake felt his stomach twist. Director? That meant... Hayes turned his sharp, discerning eyes on the officers before nodding at Blackwell. "Sir, we came as soon as we got your message." Blake's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He wasn't just dealing with some bureaucrat. Hayes was one of the highest-ranking officials in the department, a man known for having zero tolerance for misconduct. If he was here, that meant things were already in motion. Jonathan took a step back, giving Hayes a full view of the scene. "Officer Blake here pulled me over without cause," he said smoothly, then escalated the situation before realizing who I was. Hayes's expression didn't shift, but Blake saw the way his jaw tensed. "Is that so?" Blake opened his mouth, desperate to speak, to explain, to excuse himself. "Sir," Officer Miller cut in suddenly, his voice steady but nervous. "It's true. Officer Blake initiated the stop without justification." Blake whipped his head toward him, betrayal flashing in his eyes. "Miller, shut up." "I'd advise against that," Hayes interrupted coldly, leveling Blake with a stare that made his breath hitch. "Unless you'd like to make this worse for yourself." Blake swallowed hard. He clenched his fists, but his usual bravado had evaporated, leaving only the sinking realization that there was no talking his way out of this. Hayes turned to Blackwell. "Would you like to file a formal complaint, sir?" Jonathan studied Blake for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. "I want him off the streets," he said, his voice firm but calm. "How you handle that is up to you." Blake's stomach dropped. Off the streets? His career, his entire life. It could all end right here, right now. Hayes nodded once, understanding the weight of the request. "Consider it handled." He turned toward Blake. "You're suspended, effective immediately." Blake's mouth went dry. "Wait. Turn in your badge and weapon," Hayes continued, his voice unwavering. "Now." Blake hesitated, looking between Blackwell and Hayes, searching for some way out, but there was none. Slowly, his fingers fumbled with the clasp of his belt. The weight of his badge, once a symbol of power, now felt like an anchor dragging him into the abyss. He unhooked it, setting it in Hayes's outstretched hand, followed by his gun. The street was silent, the weight of the moment suffocating. Blackwell finally took a step closer to Blake, lowering his voice so only he could hear. "You thought you were untouchable," he said, his tone measured but laced with finality. "But power doesn't come from a badge. It comes from integrity." Blake couldn't meet his gaze. Jonathan took a step back, then nodded to Hayes. "I'll be in touch." Without another word, he turned and walked away, his presence leaving a void in the air. The sound of the black sedan's door opening and closing signaled the end of the confrontation. As the car pulled away, Blake stood motionless, the cold realization settling over him. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one in control. And he never would be again. The silence after Blackwell's departure felt heavier than the weight of Blake's own badge in Hayes's hand. The streetlights above buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow on the pavement, as if illuminating the stark reality of the situation. Blake had gone from predator to prey in the span of minutes, and now, with his badge and gun surrendered, he felt stripped of everything that had once made him feel untouchable. Hayes gave him one last look, disappointed but unsurprised, before stepping away to make a call. Officer Miller, shifting uncomfortably, cleared his throat. "You should have just let him go," Miller muttered, shaking his head. "None of this would be happening if you had just used your head." Blake turned to him sharply, his face twisting with anger. "You stabbed me in the back," Miller scoffed. "You stabbed yourself." He gestured toward Hayes. "And now you're bleeding out." Blake clenched his fists. The humiliation burned inside him. But more than that, it was the realization of what came next. Suspension wasn't just time off. It was the beginning of the end. An investigation. The kind where they didn't just look at today, but at every stop, every complaint, every single moment in his career where his badge had given him power over others. And he knew there were plenty of moments they'd find. Hayes finished his call and returned, his gaze still ice-cold. "You have 24 hours to report to the precinct and complete the necessary paperwork. You're relieved of duty until further notice." Blake wanted to argue, but the words dried up in his throat. There was nothing he could say that would change this outcome. "Get in your car and leave," Hayes ordered. Blake hesitated, his pride warring with his self-preservation. But ultimately, there was no fight left to win. Without another word, he turned, walking toward his patrol car. No, the patrol car, because it was no longer his. Every step felt heavier, dragging him deeper into an abyss he never thought he'd face. As he climbed inside, gripping the wheel with trembling fingers, he heard Miller speak to Hayes in a low voice. "What happens now?" "That depends on the department review," Hayes replied. "But I'll tell you this, he's done. He just doesn't know it yet." Blake forced himself to stare straight ahead, but the truth cut deep. He wasn't a cop anymore. He was just a man who had pushed too far, one who had finally been caught. He turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life. But as he drove away from the scene, he couldn't escape the suffocating weight of his own downfall. And for the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to be powerless. Blake sat in his darkened living room, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table before him. The silence in his apartment was suffocating, pressing down on him like an unseen force. His badge and gun were gone, his future uncertain, and the one thing that had defined him for years, the power of the uniform, had been stripped away in an instant. His phone buzzed. He ignored it. He knew who it was, his union rep, maybe even his captain. It didn't matter. Nothing they could say would change the fact that his career was now under a microscope, and every decision he had ever made was about to be scrutinized. A sharp knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. His heart pounded. Was it internal affairs? Had the investigation moved faster than expected? He took a deep breath and stood, steadying himself before opening the door. To his surprise, it wasn't an investigator. It was Miller. Blake narrowed his eyes. "What do you want?" Miller stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "I want to know what the hell you were thinking." Blake scoffed. "You came all the way here to lecture me?" "No," Miller said, his voice tight with frustration. "I came here because I know what's coming, and I don't think you do." Blake leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Enlighten me." Miller exhaled sharply. "Blackwell isn't just some government official. He's got connections. The kind that can bury you so deep you'll never crawl out. And after what you pulled tonight, he's going to make sure you never wear a badge again." Blake felt a cold dread creep up his spine, but he refused to show it. "So what? You're here to tell me to beg for mercy?" "No," Miller said. "I'm here to tell you to be smart. IEA is going to dig through your entire record. Every stop, every complaint, every use of force. If they find anything questionable, you're done." Blake tensed. "There's nothing to find." Miller gave him a long, knowing look. "We both know that's not true." Blake clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but deep down, he knew Miller was right. He had gotten away with things before. Small infractions, moments of unchecked authority that no one had bothered to question. But now, Every single one of those moments was about to resurface. "You need to lawyer up," Miller continued, "and fast." Blake let out a bitter laugh. "And what? Fight this? You just said it yourself. Blackwell has the power to end me." Miller hesitated. "There's another option." Blake frowned. "What are you talking about?" Miller sighed, running a hand through his hair. "If you cooperate, if you admit fault and show remorse, there's a chance they'll go easy on you. Maybe you don't keep your badge, but at least you don't leave in disgrace." Blake's stomach churned. The idea of groveling, of admitting defeat, made him sick. "You want me to beg?" "I want you to survive this," Miller shot back, "because right now, you're drowning, and the only way out is to own up to what you did." Blake turned away, staring at the empty wall in front of him. He had spent his entire career believing he was untouchable, but now, faced with the consequences of his own actions, he realized that the walls were closing in fast, and for the first time he wasn't sure if he could escape. The next morning, Blake could barely bring himself to leave the apartment. The weight of his decisions, his arrogance, his rashness, his belief that he was invincible, pressed down on him with the force of 1,000 pounds. He knew his career was over, but what haunted him the most was the fact that he was about to lose everything that had once made him feel like he mattered. His identity, his status, all of it slipping away in a blur of regret. He stood at the window, watching as the sun began to rise, painting the city skyline in shades of gold and red. He had always admired the city's strength, its pulse, its unyielding motion. But now, it seemed as though everything around him was moving forward without him. Everything he had once taken for granted, the trust of his fellow officers, the respect from the community, even the power that came with his badge, was vanishing before his eyes. Blake rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion seep into his bones. The phone on the counter buzzed again, and this time he picked it up. It was a text from Miller. "You need to get to the precinct. IA wants to talk to you. They're going to ask about last night." Blake let out a long, defeated breath. The reality was settling in. It wasn't just about Blackwell anymore. It was about every choice he had made, every person he had mistreated, every situation where he had crossed the line. And now, internal affairs was going to tear him apart. He grabbed his jacket, staring at the empty space on the wall where his badge used to hang. For a moment, he almost reached for it, almost thought about putting it back on, just for a little while longer. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the realization that he had already lost that part of himself. Maybe it was because he knew that putting it back on would only make the fall harder. By the time Blake arrived at the precinct, the air felt thick, oppressive. He walked through the door, his shoes tapping against the cold tile floor, each step echoing in the empty hallway. The officers who usually greeted him with a nod or a word of acknowledgement turned away when they saw him. No one wanted to be associated with a man who had become a liability. Blake entered the meeting room where Internal Affairs was waiting. He took a seat, his back straight, but his palms were slick with sweat. He knew what was coming, but the waiting was the worst part. The room felt smaller, darker, the air heavier with each passing second. The door opened, and two officers from Internal Affairs walked in, one older, one younger. The older officer, a woman with sharp features and cold eyes, set a folder on the table before her. She didn't even look at Blake as she sat down. "Officer Blake," she said, her voice as cold as her stare. "We've reviewed the events of last night, and I think you know why we're here." Blake nodded, swallowing hard. "I know." His voice sounded foreign to him, weak, as if it wasn't his own. The younger officer spoke up, his voice less formal but no less harsh. "You abused your authority. You allowed personal bias to cloud your judgment, and you've put this department in jeopardy. Blackwell is well connected, and you've made enemies who will be coming after you now." Blake clenched his fists under the table. He didn't need anyone to tell him that. He already knew. He had spent his career stepping on people. using his badge to justify his actions. Now, the consequences were crashing down on him. The older officer continued, "But what you did last night was the final straw. You not only disrespected a government official, but you violated the very principles this department is supposed to uphold. You're a liability, Officer Blake." Blake's chest tightened. He felt the world closing in on him, the weight of their words pressing down on him until he could hardly breathe. He knew what they were going to say next, but still, hearing it aloud made it feel so much more real. "We've decided to recommend termination," the older officer said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "We'll file the necessary paperwork, and you'll be escorted off the premises immediately." Blake's heart sank, but there was no fight left in him. He had seen this coming, and yet he hadn't prepared for how it would feel to hear it spoken aloud. His career was over. His identity was gone. And all that was left was the cold reality of what he had done to get here. "You're dismissed," the officer added, her eyes never leaving his face. Blake stood slowly, his legs unsteady as if the weight of the decision had made him physically weaker. He reached for the door, his hand trembling as he gripped the handle. Before he could leave, the younger officer spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You could have been something different, Blake. You didn't have to end like this." Blake didn't reply. He couldn't. There was nothing left to say. He stepped out of the room, the door closing behind him with a finality that sent a chill through his body. And as he walked out of the precinct for the first time in years, he truly felt like just another man. No longer a cop, no longer a figure of power. Blake left the precinct with his head down, every step echoing in his mind, a constant reminder of what he had just lost. The city around him was bustling as usual, a blur of faces and sounds, but none of it felt real. He couldn't shake the weight of the conversation with internal affairs, the certainty that his life was no longer his own. He had always thought that he could control his destiny, that his badge and the power it brought were invincible, but now he was nothing more than another fallen officer. His phone buzzed again, but this time Blake didn't even look at it. It was probably just another message from Miller, or maybe from his lawyer, trying to figure out how to minimize the damage. What could they possibly say to fix this? There was no fixing it. His career was in ruins, and his pride, what was left of it, was shattered into pieces. As Blake continued to walk, he noticed a familiar face up ahead. It was Miller, standing by the corner of the street, looking at him with a mix of concern and pity. Miller had been his friend, his partner in crime for years, the one person who had always had his back. But now, Blake could see the distance in his eyes, the unspoken realization that things would never be the same between them. Blake approached him slowly, not knowing what to say. "Miller." Miller shook his head, his lips pressed into a tight line. "I'm sorry, man. I didn't think it would come to this." Blake's eyes narrowed, a flash of anger flaring inside him. "You didn't think? You didn't think? You knew what was happening, Miller. You knew the risks I was taking. You just stood there, watching me go down this path, and now you want to act like you didn't know?" Miller looked down, guilt written all over his face. "I didn't think it would get this bad, Blake. I thought we could handle it, you know? But last night, when I saw you with Blackwell, I knew it was over." Blake clenched his fists, struggling to contain the rage building inside him. He wanted to scream at Miller, tell him how much this betrayal hurt, how much it cut deep to realize that the one person he thought he could trust was now just another reminder of his fall from grace. But instead, he just let out a long breath, deflating in exhaustion. "You were supposed to be my friend," Blake said quietly. "But you never had the guts to say anything, did you? You never told me I was wrong, even when you saw me crossing lines. You just let me do whatever I wanted, and now look where we are." Miller opened his mouth to respond, but Blake cut him off. "Save it. You're just like everyone else. You all let me destroy myself. And now, I have nothing." He turned away from Miller, his heart heavy with the weight of his own failure. He couldn't even face the man who had once been his closest ally. There was no room left for excuses, no time left for regrets. His world had crumbled, and there was nothing he could do to rebuild it. As Blake walked away, he spotted a familiar figure in the distance. It was Blackwell standing across the street, watching him with a knowing look. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Blake felt a wave of shame wash over him. Blackwell didn't need to say a word. His expression said everything. He had already won. Blake felt a bitter laugh rise in his throat, but it died in his chest before it could escape. He had never imagined that Blackwell, the man he had tried to humiliate, would be the one to come out on top. But now, as Blake stood there, defeated, he realized that Blackwell had always been more than just a government official. He had been a symbol of power, real power, something Blake had never truly understood until it was too late. With his shoulders slumped, Blake made his way back home. There was no point in trying to salvage anything anymore. He didn't have a job, he didn't have his badge, and he sure as hell didn't have his self-respect. The only thing he had left was the long road of consequences that lay ahead of him. The door to his apartment creaked as he pushed it open, and the silence that greeted him felt like a weight on his chest. It had only been hours since his world had imploded, and yet it felt like a lifetime. Everything was different now. Blake collapsed on the couch, his body sinking into the cushions as the exhaustion from the past few days washed over him. He didn't know what to do next. He didn't know where to go from here. All he knew was that he couldn't keep running from his mistakes, no matter how much he wanted to. But as he lay there, staring at the ceiling, a thought crossed his mind, a small flicker of realization. Maybe this was the beginning of something else. Maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to start over. He had lost everything, yes. But in losing it all, Blake had gained something more valuable than power or respect. He had gained humility. It wasn't the kind of victory he had ever imagined, but maybe it was the one he needed. Blake woke up the next morning with a heavy feeling in his chest. The world outside seemed to move on as usual, the usual noise of traffic and chatter from pedestrians filling the air. Yet everything felt different, as though he were standing on the edge of something big, something he couldn't quite define. His entire life had been about power, control, and self-preservation. But now, he wasn't sure who he was without those things. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his reflection in the mirror, still disheveled from the night before. It wasn't just his career that had been taken from him. It was his identity. The man who had walked through the world with certainty, with arrogance, was gone. Now he was left to pick up the pieces. But there was something else. A shift. A quiet recognition that maybe this was the beginning of something new. He had no job, no friends to lean on, and the badge he had once worn with pride was now in someone else's hands. But what he did have was the truth. And with that truth, he knew he could rebuild. Blake stood up, pulling on his jacket and walking to the kitchen. He felt numb, but at least the movement made him feel alive, even for just a moment. His phone buzzed again, and this time, he picked it up. It was a message from Miller. "I'm sorry, Blake. I was wrong. I should have told you sooner. You're not the only one who's paying the price for everything that happened. But I think we can fix this. We can start over. If you're willing, I'll help you." Blake stared at the message for a long time. It wasn't easy to forgive, especially after everything Miller had done. But he had learned something over the past few days. Forgiveness wasn't about letting people off the hook. It was about letting himself move forward. He didn't have to carry the weight of betrayal anymore. He typed a quick reply. "It's not too late. Let's fix it." And just like that, something shifted. Blake didn't have to do it alone anymore. He could work with Miller, with others who still believed in him, to make amends and rebuild his life. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Blake felt like he had a purpose. The days that followed were filled with meetings, paperwork, and difficult conversations. Blake had to face the consequences of his actions and earn back the trust he had lost. It was a long road, but he was committed to walking it. He had been stripped of everything that had once defined him, but in that loss, he found a new strength. And then, one day, Blake received a letter. It was from Blackwell. "Blake, I've been watching you. It's not easy to admit when you've made mistakes, especially when you've built your life on power. But I see the change in you. You've proven that you're capable of more than just being a cop. You've shown that you can be someone who stands for what's right, someone who doesn't run from the truth. I'm offering you a chance to join me, not as a cop, but as someone who can help us bring real change to this city. If you're ready, we can make a difference. Blackwell." Blake couldn't believe it. After everything, Blackwell, the man he had tried to break, was offering him a chance to redeem himself in a way he had never imagined. This wasn't just about clearing his name or returning to his old life. This was about making a real impact, about using his knowledge of the system to change it from within. Blake sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of it all. He had fallen so far, but now it seemed like there was a chance to rise again. Not for the fame, not for the power, but for something bigger than himself. He took a deep breath and looked out the window. The city was still there, unchanged, but for the first time, Blake didn't feel lost. He wasn't the man he had once been, but that was okay. He was something new now, a man with a purpose. The phone buzzed again. It was Miller. "Are you in?" Blake smiled. "Yeah, I'm in." And with that, Blake knew that while the road ahead wouldn't be easy, it was his road to walk. The system might have broken him, but it couldn't define him anymore. He had a chance to rewrite his story, and this time, he would do it right. He picked up his jacket and walked out the door. The world was waiting. Thank you for watching this video. Now tell me in the comments what you would have done in this situation and your thoughts on this story. Consider subscribing to keep bringing you more stories like this.